Hi, my name is John Clark. Onalee McGraw and I have been friends for about 35 years or so.
What we focus on at our institute is the development of classic film study guides and piloting of great classic films as an educational tool for today's generations rising up.
And what you're about to see really shows how movies can move people to greater things, to be more virtuous, to be better men and women, and to help raise your children in a way that can artistically communicate to them. So it's nice to be in a local theater. This is, most people aren't watching movies this way anymore, right? They go and they watch them on their TV, but this is kind of a new thing, right?
It was just part of our whole community life. Mm-hmm. And the theater was really the center of the community life. Of course, the war was just winding up, and for example, the selling of war bonds. The manager of the theater would come out and the theater would be packed, and there'd be like a raffle or something, and most people knew who he was.
Well, community was not only getting together to see the film, but something on the screen, right? Community was a big theme in the older movies.
Two that really come to my mind would be It's a Wonderful Life, and then I think about George Stevens' Shane, I think is having a tremendous idea of people coming together. Sure. I think one thing that comes through in It's a Wonderful Life is that everyone plays an incredibly important role in the story, and they play an incredibly important part of the community. George Stevens, Frank Capra, William Wyler, these great directors, they all had the experience of making movies before the war, going through World War II actively, and then coming home and making movies again. They came to see, maybe in that post-war period, what they had been fighting for.
Sincerely, I love you so dearly, I follow you, darling, to any shore.
When you see, for example, the Run on the Bank scene, Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed have just gotten married. And that very moment, they're driving down the street and the whole community is in chaos. So there has to be this leadership that George Bailey has to help people to understand the meaning of the common good.
Let's actually take a look at that scene. We can do that right here.
Now, we can get through this thing all right. We've got to stick together, though. We've got to have faith in each other.
But my husband hasn't worked in over a year, and I need money.
How am I going to live until the bank opens?
I got doctor bills to pay. I need cash.
I can't feed my kids on faith. I've got to have...
How much do you need?
Hey! I got $2,000. Here's $2,000. This will tide us over to the bank reopens. All right, Tom, how much do you need?
The greatness of the classic films is that you have collaboration between the screenwriter, the director, and the performers at this highly excellent level. I mean, anyone who would talk about the body of George Stevens' work, they're always going to mention Shane first.
Really?
Just as if they talk about the body of Frank Capra's work, they're always going to mention It's a Wonderful Life first. People can disagree about which is the absolute greatest film that these great people did. It's what makes for the greatness is the collaborative art was so finely well developed in that time. When you go through a whole lot as a whole society, you can look deeper into the fact that we really are all connected as human beings. The threads of culture are broken up and frayed. People are divided. There's a lot of hatred and contempt and politicization. People don't read as much as they used to. So a way to rediscover our common humanity is to see it on the screen.
So I know that you've written a lot about the movie production code, which was, the dates would be like late 20s, early 30s. What was the time frame for the code?
The actual time that the code was announced was 1930. But it didn't become operational until 1934. It was developed because the films were often very coarse, very sleazy. People in the different communities would call for scenes to be taken out of the film, so it was very expensive, it was very difficult. The call was for some way to have self-policing, self-restraint on the part of the movie industry itself. Otherwise, there was going to be federal censorship. But it was basically Father Daniel Lord. He developed the language of the code, which basically said, because the motion pictures are so powerful on the human psyche, that the sympathy of the audience will not be drawn to the side of wrongdoing, crime, or sin. Things that are wrong, things that are evil. So there was the idea that there is good and that there is evil. And it's part of that whole idea that we share a common humanity. And FDR, being newly elected President of the United States, and a kind of cultural reset. Where are we going as a culture? The motion pictures would be at the very center of this.
Every group in the motion picture industry has pledged the President, through me as the Deputy Administrator in charge of the Motion Picture Industry Code, that not only will the motion picture industry immediately write and enforce its own code under the National Recovery Administration, but will extend every facility from every group and division to enforce all of the codes under the National Recovery Administration.
This was a group of people who wanted the moviegoer to leave the theater a better person than when they walked in.
It would be the whole classical view that we have a better side and a worse side. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, gradually it became clear to me that the line between good and evil runs right through the human heart.
Wow. Is there an example you give of maybe a movie that had a hard time making it but eventually did?
Double Indemnity. It took 8 years to get a script approval. The characters who commit the crime of murder, they do get caught in the end, in the sense that they're on a ship and they jump off and commit suicide. But they don't really confront the evil that they've done. And so it took 8 years to get the characters developed. Raymond Chandler and Wilder wrote the script together. They figured out to make the characters aware of the evil they were doing. And so the way they did that was to have the leading man, Walter Neff, dictating.
Yes, I killed him. I killed him for money and for a woman. And I didn't get the money, and I didn't get the woman.
What you're seeing is the human person as we understand humans to be able to think about the difference between right and wrong and make a moral decision, even if you've made mistakes. I mean, you're talking about a guy that winds up killing 2 people. In the crucial scene, he doesn't let this man he doesn't even particularly like very well take the rap for what he himself has done. There's some kind of universal understanding of human nature. Within that, there is a great art of storytelling, and the most compelling and beautiful way to tell a story is visually, so that you can see the faces of the people.
So what makes a film a classic film? What are the elements it has that sort of modern ones have missed out on?
One of the most profound things is the psychological impact on the viewer. This was told to me by a young man in his late 20s who was the manager of a video rental store. He said, with classic films, we are participants in the drama with the players. With the newer films, we're observers being entertained. I would have sensed it, but I grew up with the films. So I wouldn't really be in a position to judge, but he would. He'd learned the classic movies from his grandmother.
So maybe giving a few examples of what the classic movies have to teach us today. Are there a couple movies that stand out to you that we need to hear today in America?
I would think about the films of Humphrey Bogart, one of the greatest of the classic era. And one of the reasons is that his characters, they're in a great search for answers and what they're going to do in the struggle of good over evil.
Okay.
Evil can be thought of as so powerful, there's nothing we can do. This is this fatalism that we are so infected with today. And so the classic films had an objective sense, an objective view of the world. And Key Largo does this so beautifully because it has moral courage. It's not just physical courage in fighting evil, it's making that decision to confront evil. So it really shows the dignity of the human person when it's violated in the classic films. It's much more close up and intimate. The conflict comes through the characters, through the very close, intimate way that we're with those characters in those places where this conflict is going on. And so you can't help but feel drawn to the good, to want the good. One of the places where we were able to go was a detention home, and I will never forget what happened there, which is a testimony to the great power of these films for everyone. There were a group of young men. When Jane first introduced It's a Wonderful Life, they were going to rip the VHS right out of the machine. She said, give it a chance. Please give this a chance. At one point, they said, this is the greatest film we've ever seen.
Wow.
When It's a Wonderful Life went out on television, there was a man going to commit suicide right in a prison. And he wrote to Frank Capra himself and said, your movie convinced me not to take my life. Frank Capra himself was very depressed. He was a very volatile guy, you know, very strong in his artistic temperament.
So how did you get to be such a fan of classic films?
I started out watching It's a Wonderful Life when I was just 7 years old. Around the age of 10, I really was, frankly, obsessed with movies.
So being on Turner Classic Movies, that must have been one of the great thrills of your life, I'm guessing, right?
The 20th anniversary of TCM. I entered with No Way Out, which was Sidney Poitier's very first film. A great film that combats racism. TCM let me introduce 12 Angry Men, one of the greatest films about justice, with Robert Osborne, this legendary man who probably did more than any other to preserve the legacy of classic film. He understood classic film and what truly does make a film a classic. Each one of us received his wonderful book on the Oscars, so we were all just absolutely in love with these films.
You've talked a lot about civil rights and how some of the movies that you've written about preceded really the civil rights movement, or maybe sort of got it started. What are a couple of the movies there that made an impact?
It's amazing that two hugely significant films of Sidney Poitier. No Way Out is a movie that showed the universality of human dignity. It revolves around a psychopathic racist played by Richard Widmark and Sidney in his very first film. These two men became lifelong friends. Widmark did not want to play that role, but for the greater good, this great actor accepted that part of a psychopathic racist.
Right.
Sidney Poitier went on to play in this incredibly important film story, A Raisin in the Sun. She was written by Lorraine Hansberry. She was a Chicago native, first Black woman playwright to break out onto Broadway. This is right before the civil rights movement is going to take off. People say this is Sidney Poitier's greatest performance. He has to go from being a really materialistic, empty person to facing up to what it means to be a husband, what it means to be a father, and most of all, what it means to be a man in society.
That's such a great scene for me watching that as a father, is when Sidney Poitier is actually teaching his son why it's important to be a good man, despite the fact the world may not be good, and why it's important to be just, even if we're living in an unjust world.
Is my son. My son. And he makes the sixth generation of my family in this country.
So what would be some other examples of movies that talk about cultural goods or things that we can learn cultural goods from?
The Shop Around the Corner with Jimmy Stewart and Margaret Sullivan shines out with how they find each other when they really don't know who each other is.
Oh, okay.
You have The Shop, which is in fact your community right there.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Roman Holiday is such an incredible film showing self-sacrificing love in the end, yet there's the elevation of this couple finding each other, riding around on a scooter all over Rome. It's a discovery, and the different pieces of life are there. You have this ideal of giving yourself wholly to another person, even in a way that you may not even be in the end together. Two other movies that do that beautifully. It Happened One Night, right in the middle of the Depression, and then you have Love with the Proper Stranger, right on the beginning of the sexual revolution, made 30 years apart. And yet you take these two couples, and what do you find? They're living in a real community, they have family relationships, they have cultural norms, and they have a moral choice to make.
Well, I think the thing about with Steve McQueen's character in Love with the Proper Stranger is he realizes marriage is difficult.
A lot of young people today have given up on the idea that they can find a person and even have a stable marriage. So if there's a way through the poetic mode, not lecturing at people or making them tired with statistics on how our society is going to go down the drain if we don't have people forming families, the best way is through classical storytelling.
Well, I think that what the love scenes do in all the classic movies, I think, they challenge the viewer to become a better person, to be worthy of the beloved. It's that journey together, and I think that the great films show that in such an artistic way. It did such a great job. You made some great points of it. It's a Wonderful Life. What do you say we go to the movies?
That's a great idea, John.
All right, let's go. So one of the things in older movies that is not as present now would be natural law, for one, and the theme of justice, right? I know you've written a lot about that. What would be a movie or two that sort of takes a look at those and examines them more closely?
Well, the one I was able to introduce with Robert Osborne, 12 Angry Men, is honestly the definitive film on justice. The characters are confined into this jury room, and each one coming to understand what justice is, each in their own way, according to like their own temperaments, their own personalities, and you really come to see what civic friendship can be, what it means to be a citizen engaged with other citizens that you don't agree with. And this is what our young people need to be exploring. People involved in higher education, high school education, they need to take movies like 12 Angry Men and see that you could actually show what justice is to overcome like this group identity politics that we're afflicted with in our country today. Identifying what's right and what's wrong according to the particular identity group you belong to is going to wear us all out, and we will lose our free society.
Movies are performing a very vital function. The classic films, they've sort of replaced, in a way, literature. In a time when people are not reading, this is something that families can watch together, or groups can watch together, and try to determine the things that Plato was trying to answer, and Socrates. What is justice on screen?
Exactly. The deepest truths that we're searching for can be searched for together, actually joining together
Sure.
the way that we used to do in this country, going to the movies.
You know, 12 Angry Men, I know it's one of your favorites. I actually watch that movie at least once a year to sort of reacquaint myself to the fact that there are certain things that I may have a bias and try to find those in myself. But there's one scene in particular that I find really interesting that for me was transformational, where the juror helps the man he's been arguing with the entire film. He realizes that he stood out in all the wrong ways in that jury room. But the juror helps the other juror put his jacket back on to say, you still have dignity. You know, it's something that as a viewer, I aspire to. I want to be that man who helps the man put his jacket back on.
I think what you've just described is a path to restoring civility. And I think about Jimmy Stewart in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Even though it's all about politics, it's really pre-political because it's about people doing the right thing. They just happen to be in the United States Congress instead of a jury room or a Western community that's afflicted by villains. Both Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and 12 Angry Men, the leading men of those two movies, Henry Fonda and Jimmy Stewart, were best friends. Henry Fonda was the liberal
Right.
in both politics and religion, and Jimmy Stewart was the conservative in both politics and religion. And yet they were absolutely close and dedicated to one another. They were dedicated to their countries, and they were dedicated to their craft as actors. And I think we take a cue from these two men for today.
That's true.
And we say, let's try to restore our culture with cultural goods. Let's teach our young people about what these cultural goods are
Sure.
and why they were good.
Yeah.
And then let the movies themselves take all the weight of the teaching. Let's say somebody over here has had a really bad life experience. And they're very deeply wounded by what their family members have done. And over here you have some spoiled brat that's always had everything go right. And over here you have somebody in the middle. The movies have their own weight of the truth
Well, that's true.
that absolutely weigh in for everybody.
I know that's really like the heart of all these movies is that we see what's on the screen. And really the screen is a bit of a mirror for us, I think, right? It's sort of, we see ourselves on the screen and think, okay, how could I react? How could I mirror the person, you know, that I'm watching? But I think to your point, those movies are so great at making us ask ourselves challenging questions and aspire to being as great as the people we're seeing on the screen.